Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I never thought the biggest betrayal in my life would come from my own family. Imagine finding out that your dad secretly dated your wife before you even met her, and now your mom expects you to forgive them like nothing happened. It started like any other Saturday. My mom had asked me to help her clean out the attic, a chore I'd been putting off for weeks. She said she needed some old photo albums to complete a family scrapbook project, and I, being the ever-dutiful son, finally gave in. The attic was hot, dusty, and packed to the brim with boxes that hadn't been touched in decades. I shifted aside stacks of Christmas decorations and old school projects before finding a box labeled Family Memories. Curious, I popped the lid open and began flipping through albums. Most of the photos were typical family stuff: birthdays, vacations, and awkward holiday portraits. Then, I came across a photo that made my heart stop. In it, my wife, Sarah, was sitting on a red and white picnic blanket. She wasn't alone. My dad was next to her, laughing, and his arm was casually draped over her shoulders. They looked intimate, too comfortable. My stomach churned as I stared at the image, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. At first, I told myself it couldn't be Sarah. Maybe it was someone who just resembled her. The thought was almost comforting until I realized the odds of such a coincidence were slim to none. My hands were shaking as I stared at the photo. I needed answers. Without even thinking, I carried the album downstairs to my mom, who was organizing boxes in the living room. "Hey mom, who is this?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I held up the picture. The moment her eyes landed on it, her expression changed. Her face froze like she'd been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to. Then, in an instant, she snatched the album out of my hands. "That's not important," she said hastily, shoving the album back into the box. "Just leave it alone, okay?" Her words didn't sit right with me. My mom, who was usually calm and easygoing, was acting like I'd unearthed a dark secret. Her reaction only fueled my curiosity. "No, Mom," I pressed. "Who is this?" "That's Sarah, isn't it? And Dad." She wouldn't look me in the eye. "It's nothing, honey. It was a long time ago. Just forget you saw it." Her voice had that clipped tone she used when she didn't want to argue, but I wasn't letting this go. I needed answers, and if she wasn't going to give them to me, I'd get them elsewhere. That night, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. My mom's cryptic reaction only made it worse. I went home and sat on the couch with the album, staring at the picture until Sarah came into the room. "What's that?" she asked, noticing the album in my lap. I didn't say anything at first. I just held up the photo. The moment she saw it, her face drained of color. Her body went stiff, and she let out a shaky breath. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "In the attic," I replied. "It's you, isn't it? You and my dad?" Sarah didn't respond immediately. She just stared at the picture like it was some ghost from her past. Finally, she sank onto the couch beside me and said, "I can explain." Her voice was trembling, and the way she avoided my gaze told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't about to deny it. This wasn't some misunderstanding. "Explain what?" I demanded, my frustration boiling over. "What the hell is going on, Sarah?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence between us felt suffocating. All I could do was sit there, my mind spinning, as the woman I loved struggled to come up with an explanation. Sarah sat next to me on the couch, her face pale and her hands trembling. She looked like she was staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, and in some ways, I was demanding answers, and I wasn't about to let her off the hook. After what felt like an eternity, she finally started talking. "It was a long time ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Almost 10 years. I was young, and I didn't know what I wanted in life. Your dad and we dated for a couple of months." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My dad and Sarah? Dated? The very thought made my skin crawl. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edges of the photo album like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Because it wasn't serious," she said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It didn't mean anything. We went out a few times, but it didn't work. We both realized we weren't right for each other and ended it. That's all. That's all." I repeated, incredulous. "Sarah, you dated my dad. Do you have any idea how messed up that is?" She flinched at my tone, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't know you back then," she said, her voice cracking. "It was years before we even met. Why would I think it mattered?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could she think this wasn't worth mentioning? How could she keep this from me, especially when she knew I valued honesty above everything else? But my dad knew, I said, the realization dawning on me like a dark cloud rolling in. He knew the whole time. When we started dating, when we got engaged, at the wedding, he knew, and he never said a damn word. Sarah wiped her eyes, her shoulders shaking as she tried to steady herself. I told him not to say anything, she admitted. I thought it would make things awkward, and I didn't want to ruin things between us. I didn't want you to think less of me. Her words stung more than I could articulate. So you both decided it was better for me to be in the dark? That I didn't deserve to know? It wasn't like that, she protested. I wasn't trying to deceive you. I didn't think it mattered. By the time we started dating, that part of my life was long over. Your dad and I never even talk about it. It's ancient history. Ancient history? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Sarah, this isn't some random ex. This is my dad. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? How betrayed I feel? She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Please, she begged. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I love you, and I never wanted this to come between us. I stood up and started pacing the room, trying to process everything. So let me get this straight, I said, my voice growing louder. You dated my dad, you decided it wasn't worth mentioning, and then you just went on with life like nothing happened? And he went along with it? Neither of you thought for a second that I might want to know? Sarah broke down in tears, sobbing into her hands. I don't know what else to say, she choked out. I didn't think it was a big deal. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting me? I scoffed. This isn't protecting me, Sarah. This is lying by omission. Do you have any idea how messed up this is? She didn't answer, and for a while, the only sound in the room was her quiet sobs. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't. Not yet. I was too angry, too hurt. Finally, I stopped pacing and turned to face her. Does my mom know? Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She found out after we got engaged. Your dad told her, and she told him to keep it quiet. She thought it would be better if you didn't know. Of course, my mom was involved. It was like every pillar of trust one had in my family was crumbling before my eyes. Unbelievable, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. Everyone knew except me. Everyone decided I didn't deserve the truth. It wasn't like that, Sarah said again, but her words felt hollow. I need some air, I said abruptly, grabbing my keys and heading for the door. Please don't leave, Sarah called after me, but I couldn't stay. Not in that moment. I needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out how to untangle the mess my life had become. As I drove aimlessly through the night, one question kept playing over and over in my mind. How do you move forward when the people you trust most are the ones who've let you down? The next morning, I woke up with the kind of tension in my chest that feels like a physical weight. The night before had been a whirlwind of revelations and emotions, and I barely slept. My mind wouldn't stop replaying Sarah's confession, my dad's silence, and the sheer absurdity of it all. How had my entire life become a soap opera overnight? I decided to confront my mom. After all, she was the one who practically raised me to believe honesty was the cornerstone of any good relationship. If anyone could give me a straight answer, it would be her. At least that's what I thought. I drove to my parents' house, my emotions a volatile mix of anger, betrayal, and desperation. My mom was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast. The sight of her going about her day like nothing was wrong ignited something in me. How could she act so normal when my entire world felt like it was crashing down? "Morning, sweetheart," she said when she saw me. "What brings you here so early?" I didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk," I said, my tone sharp enough to catch her off guard. Her smile faltered, and she set down the spatula she'd been holding. "What's wrong?" I pulled the photo out of my jacket pocket and placed it on the counter between us. Her eyes flicked to it, and her expression shifted from surprise to something more guarded. "You already know what's wrong," I said, crossing my arms. "How long were you planning to keep this from me?" She sighed, leaning against the counter. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out," she admitted. "It wasn't my place to tell you. That's between Sarah and your father." "Between Sarah and Dad?" I repeated, incredulous. "Mom, this isn't just some little secret. My wife dated my dad, and everyone decided to keep me in the dark about it. How is that not my business?" Her eyes softened, but there was a defensive edge to her voice. "It was a long time ago, sweetheart. It happened ages ago, before you and Sarah even met. It didn't mean anything." I let out a bitter laugh. "Didn't mean anything? Mom, they were in a relationship. They kept it from me. How can you stand there and act like this is no big deal?" She straightened up, her expression hardening. Because it isn't as big of a deal as you're making it out to be. People have pasts, and sometimes those pasts overlap in unexpected ways. It doesn't mean they were trying to hurt you. Her calm tone only made me angrier. You really think this is small? I asked, my voice rising. Dad and Sarah hid this from me for years. And now I'm just supposed to brush it off like it's nothing? Lower your voice, she said, glancing toward the doorway. I understand why you're upset, but yelling isn't going to solve anything. I took a deep breath, trying to rein in my frustration. I just don't get it, Mom. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't anyone tell me? She hesitated, and for the first time, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. I only found out after you and Sarah got engaged, she said quietly. Your father told me because he thought I should know, but by then, what good would it have done to tell you? You were happy. I didn't want to ruin that. Her words hit me like a slap. So you knew, I said, my voice trembling. You knew before the wedding, and you just let it happen? It wasn't my place to interfere, she insisted. You and Sarah were in love, and I didn't want to be the one to plant seeds of doubt. What good would it have done to dredge up the past? It would have only caused unnecessary pain. Unnecessary pain? I repeated, my voice thick with disbelief. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is for me? Everyone in this family knew except me. You all decided I didn't deserve the truth. I was trying to protect you, she said, her voice tinged with exasperation. Sometimes, keeping the peace is more important than dragging up old mistakes. Keeping the peace, I muttered, shaking my head. At my expense? Her face softened again, and she reached out to touch my arm. Honey, I know this is hard, but you can't let something so small ruin your family. That sentence pushed me over the edge. Small? I shouted, stepping back from her touch. This isn't small, Mom. My dad dated my wife. My wife. And you want me to just move on like it's nothing? She pursed her lips, clearly trying to keep her composure. It's not the end of the world, she said, her tone measured. You and Sarah love each other. That's what matters. Focus on the present, not on things that happened years ago. Do you even hear yourself? I asked, my voice shaking with anger. You're acting like this is some minor inconvenience. Do you not see how messed up this is? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the counter, her hands clasped tightly together. You're my son, and I love you, she said finally. But I also know that holding on to anger isn't going to help. Forgiveness is the only way forward. I stared at her, struggling to process everything she'd said. Forgiveness? How could I forgive something like this? I can't do this right now, I said, turning to leave. Please, don't let this tear us apart, she called after me. You need to talk to your father. Get his side of the story. He loves you, and he didn't mean to hurt you. Her words followed me as I walked out the door, but they brought me no comfort. All I could think about was how everyone I trusted had conspired to keep me in the dark. Forgiveness felt like a foreign concept at that moment. All I wanted were answers. After the disastrous conversation with my mom, I realized I couldn't avoid my dad any longer. As much as I didn't want to face him, I knew I needed answers. My mom's attempts to downplay the situation had only made things worse, and now I was heading straight to the source of my anger. I pulled into my parents' driveway with my heart pounding in my chest. The house looked the same as always, calm, welcoming, like the family sanctuary I'd grown up in. But today, it felt like the setting of a bad dream. When I walked in, my dad was sitting in his recliner, reading the paper like it was any other day. He glanced up and gave me his usual casual nod. Hey, kiddo, he said, folding the paper and setting it aside. His relaxed demeanor made my blood boil. How could he sit there acting like everything was fine when my entire world had been turned upside down? We need to talk, I said, my voice tight. He frowned slightly, but there was no real concern in his expression. Sure. What's on your mind? I sat down across from him, my hands clenching and unclenching as I tried to steady myself. Why didn't you tell me? His brows furrowed in confusion. Tell you what? You know what? I snapped, pulling the photo out of my pocket and tossing it onto the coffee table. This. Why didn't you tell me about this? His face remained surprisingly neutral as he glanced at the picture. He let out a small sigh, leaned back in his chair, and crossed his arms. Look, it wasn't serious, he said, his tone dismissive. I blinked, stunned by how casually he was treating this. Not serious? You dated my wife, and you didn't think that was worth mentioning? He shrugged. It was a long time ago, and it didn't last. Sarah and I both agreed it wasn't worth bringing up. We didn't want to make things awkward for you. Awkward? I repeated, my voice rising. You thought hiding the fact that you dated my wife wouldn't be awkward? Are you hearing yourself? He gave an exasperated sigh, like I was the one being unreasonable. Son, everyone has a past. People date. Relationships don't always work out. It happens. What's important is that Sarah loves you, and you two are happy together. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Are you serious right now? You're acting like this is some normal, everyday thing. It's not. You were with her, Dad. That's not something you just sweep under the rug. It wasn't like that, he said, his tone growing impatient. We went on a few dates. That's it. There were no deep feelings, no drama. It fizzled out before it even began. It wasn't some grand romance. Then why not tell me? I demanded. If it was so insignificant, why keep it a secret? Because it didn't matter, he shot back, his voice firm. We didn't want to complicate things for you. Sarah was worried you'd overreact. And judging by how you're acting right now, she was right. His words hit me like a slap. Overreact? Are you kidding me? You lied to me, Dad. Both of you. You let me marry someone without telling me the full truth about her past. And your past. He shook his head, his expression a mix of frustration and disappointment. Son, I didn't lie. I just didn't think it was necessary to bring it up. Sarah is a wonderful woman, and she's good for you. That's what matters. Why dredge up ancient history when it has no bearing on your relationship? Because it's my life. I shouted, standing up. I had a right to know. You don't get to decide what information I can handle. You don't get to play God with my life. He stood too, his calm demeanor slipping for the first time. You're acting like I committed some unforgivable sin, he said, his voice growing louder. I dated her for 2 months. 2 months. It didn't mean anything then, and it doesn't mean anything now. Grow up and move on. Those words, grow up and move on, felt like a knife to the chest. This was the man who had taught me to always take responsibility for my actions. The man who had instilled in me the importance of honesty and integrity. And now he was standing here, acting like this betrayal was my problem, not his. I stared at him, shaking with anger and disbelief. You don't get it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't get how much this hurts. You were supposed to have my back. Both of you. And instead, you chose to protect yourselves. He sighed again, this time softer, almost tired. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said. I was trying to protect you. I thought it would be easier this way. Easier for you, I said bitterly. Not for me. He didn't respond, and the silence between us stretched out, heavy and suffocating. I realized then that I wasn't going to get the apology I wanted. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong. To him, this was just a blip in the past, something I should be able to shrug off and forget. But I couldn't. Not yet. I can't do this, I said finally, turning toward the door. Where are you going? He called after me. Home, I said without looking back. As I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, I felt a wave of emotions crashing over me. Anger, sadness, betrayal. I had come here looking for closure, for some kind of understanding, but all I got was excuses. And now, I was left to figure out how to move forward when the man I'd looked up to my whole life had let me down in the worst way imaginable. By the time I got home, the anger from my confrontation with my dad hadn't subsided. If anything, it had morphed into something heavier, resentment mixed with a gnawing sense of betrayal. As I walked into the house, I saw Sarah sitting on the couch, waiting for me. She looked like she'd been crying. Her eyes were red, and her shoulders slumped like she was carrying the weight of the world. Can we talk? She asked, her voice hesitant. I didn't answer right away. I just hung my keys on the hook and stared at her, wondering how this woman, my wife, my partner, the person I thought I knew better than anyone, could have kept something like this from me. Do I even have a choice? I finally said, my voice colder than I intended. She flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she motioned for me to sit beside her. I hesitated before finally taking a seat, leaving a noticeable gap between us. I need to explain, she began, her voice trembling. You already did, I said, cutting her off. You and my dad dated. You didn't think it was worth mentioning. End of story, right? It's not that simple, she said, wiping a tear from her cheek. Please just listen to me. I crossed my arms and leaned back, signaling for her to continue. I should have told you, she admitted, her voice breaking. I should have told you a long time ago. But when we first started dating, I didn't even think about it. And then, as things got more serious, it felt impossible to bring up. I was scared it would change the way you see me. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Change the way I see you? Sarah, it's not about your past. It's about the fact that you lied to me. Both of you. You let me marry you without knowing the full truth. I didn't lie to you, she said quickly. I just didn't tell you. And not because I wanted to hurt you or keep secrets, but because I didn't think it mattered. Your dad and I weren't serious. We went on a few dates, but it fizzled out almost immediately. There were no deep feelings, no future plans. It wasn't some great love story, I swear. Then why hide it? I pressed. If it was so insignificant, why not just tell me? She hesitated, her hands wringing together in her lap. Because I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid of exactly this. I was afraid you'd look at me differently, or that you'd feel weird about us being together. And your dad agreed. He thought it would only cause problems, so we decided it was better to just move on. Move on? I repeated, shaking my head. Sarah, do you know how humiliating this is for me? My own father, my dad, knew who you were the entire time we were dating. He stood there at our wedding, smiling, knowing he'd been with you. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? Her tears were falling freely now, and she reached out to take my hand. I pulled away. I love you, she said desperately. You're the only person I've ever truly loved. Your dad was just a blip in my past. He didn't matter to me then, and he doesn't matter to me now. You're my husband, my partner, my everything. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to reach out, to wipe away her tears and tell her it was okay. But I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that picture. Her and my dad laughing together like they shared some private joke. It was like a stain on our relationship, a permanent reminder that the foundation of our marriage wasn't as solid as I'd thought. I don't know if I can get past this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Her breath hitched, and she looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. Please don't say that, she begged. We can get through this. I know we can. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. How? I asked, my voice rising. How do you make this right, Sarah? You can't undo it. You can't change the fact that you kept this from me. I don't even know who I'm angrier at. Him or you? She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she just sat there, sobbing quietly into her hands. The sight of her like that, broken, vulnerable, should have softened me, but it didn't. I need time, I said, standing up. Time for what? She asked, her voice trembling. To figure out if I can forgive you, I said, honestly. Her face crumpled, but she nodded. Take all the time you need, she said through her tears. But please, don't shut me out completely. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, I promise. I didn't respond. I just grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. I needed air, space, something to clear my head. As I walked out into the cool night, I couldn't help but wonder, could I really forgive her? Could I look past this betrayal and rebuild the trust that had been shattered? Or was this the beginning of the end for us? For the first time in my life, I didn't have the answers. And that uncertainty was almost as unbearable as the betrayal itself. I was still trying to process everything when my phone rang the next morning. The screen flashed Mom, and I hesitated before answering. After our last conversation, I wasn't exactly eager to hear what she had to say, but avoiding her would only make things worse. Hello, I said, my voice flat. Hi, sweetheart, she replied, her tone overly cheerful, too cheerful. I could tell she was trying to smooth things over, but I wasn't in the mood for small talk. What do you need, Mom? I asked, cutting straight to the point. She sighed, dropping the pretense. I wanted to check on you. I know you've been upset, and I thought we could talk. Talk about what? I said, already bracing myself. About this whole situation, she said carefully. I know it's been hard for you, but I think it's time to start moving forward. Moving forward? I repeated, incredulous. Mom, it's been barely 2 days. I can't just move forward from something like this. She let out a small, exasperated laugh, like I was being unreasonable. Honey, I understand you're hurt, but holding on to this anger isn't healthy. You need to let it go. Let it go. I snapped, my voice rising. Mom, my wife and my dad lied to me. For years. They kept something huge from me. And now you want me to just brush it off like it's no big deal? It's not about brushing it off, she said, her tone shifting to that of a lecture. It's about forgiveness. Families are complicated, and people make mistakes. But at the end of the day, we're still a family. You can't let something like this tear us apart. Her words felt like a slap in the face. So now it's my responsibility to keep the family together? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm the one who was lied to, but I'm supposed to be the bigger person? How does that make sense? It's not about assigning blame, she said quickly. It's about moving forward. Your dad didn't mean to hurt you, and neither did Sarah. They both love you. Isn't that what matters? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Mom, do you even hear yourself? You're acting like I'm the problem here, like I'm the one who did something wrong. She sighed again, and I could practically see her pinching the bridge of her nose in frustration. No one's saying you're the problem, she said. But you need to ask yourself if holding on to this anger is worth it. Is it worth tearing the family apart? Because that's what's going to happen if you don't let this go. I was stunned into silence. Was she really saying this? Was she seriously trying to guilt-trip me into forgiving them? You can't be serious, I said finally. I'm completely serious, she replied. Your dad is devastated, and Sarah is beside herself with guilt. They've both apologized and they want to make things right. But you're so focused on being angry that you're not even giving them a chance. Oh, so now it's my fault, I said, laughing bitterly. I'm the bad guy because I'm upset that the two people I trusted most lied to me. No one's calling you the bad guy, she said, her tone softening. But sometimes you have to put your pride aside for the sake of the people you love. If you can't forgive them, you're going to destroy this family. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. Destroy the family? Was she really putting that on me? The anger that had been simmering under the surface finally boiled over. You know what, Mom? I said, my voice shaking with fury. Maybe this family needs to be destroyed. Maybe it's not worth saving if everyone thinks it's okay to lie to me and then blame me for being upset about it. Don't say that, she said, her voice trembling. You don't mean it? Maybe I do, I shot back. Because right now, it feels like no one in this family actually cares about me. You care about keeping the peace. Dad cares about saving face. And Sarah? She cares about not looking like the bad guy. But who's looking out for me, huh? Who's on my side? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When my mom finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. I am on your side, she said. But being on your side doesn't mean letting you wallow in anger. It means helping you see the bigger picture. The bigger picture? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. And what's that, Mom? That I should just forgive and forget? That I should pretend none of this ever happened? No one's asking you to forget, she said. But forgiveness is the only way forward. Otherwise, you'll end up bitter and alone, pushing away everyone who cares about you. Her words stung, but I wasn't ready to back down. Maybe I'm better off alone, I said coldly. At least then I wouldn't have to deal with this constant betrayal. Don't say that, she said, her voice cracking. Please, don't let this anger consume you. You're better than this. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The conversation had drained me, leaving me feeling hollow and exhausted. Just think about it, she said finally. Think about what you're really risking by holding on to this grudge. We all love you, and we want to make things right. But you have to meet us halfway. When the call ended, I sat in silence, her words echoing in my head. Was I being unreasonable? Was I letting my anger destroy the people I cared about? Or was I finally standing up for myself after years of being the one to compromise? For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about the secret. It was about control, about how everyone expected me to sacrifice my feelings for the sake of peace. And I wasn't sure I could live with that. In the weeks following my mom's ultimatum, I felt like I was living in a pressure cooker. Everywhere I turned, there was tension, guilt, and a sense of suffocating inevitability. I stopped going to family gatherings altogether. I couldn't stomach sitting across from my dad, pretending like everything was fine when it wasn't. Worse still, being around Sarah had become just as difficult. Every interaction felt stilted, as if we were both trying too hard not to say the wrong thing. The easy, comfortable rhythm we'd once shared was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of awkwardness that neither of us could ignore. I started staying late at work, finding excuses to avoid coming home right after. When I was home, I'd bury myself in meaningless distractions. TV, scrolling through my phone, mindlessly cleaning anything I could find, just to avoid conversations with Sarah. She tried to reach out, to bridge the gap between us, but I wasn't ready to meet her halfway. Meanwhile, my mom's texts became a near-daily occurrence. Every message was some variation of the same theme. Have you thought about what I said? Your dad misses you. Family is everything. I'd read them, roll my eyes, and leave them unanswered. How could I explain to her that family didn't feel like much of a blessing right now? Sarah tried her best to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She cooked dinner most nights, even when I barely touched it. She made small talk about her day, even though my responses were clipped and distant. One night, as I was scrolling through my phone on the couch, she sat down next to me and placed a hand on my arm. Can we talk? She asked, her voice soft but insistent. I set my phone down and sighed. About what? About us, she said. About everything? I didn't respond, so she pressed on. I can't do this anymore, she said, her voice trembling. The silence, the distance, it's killing me. I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't know how to stop it. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her we'd find a way through this, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words. I don't know what to say, Sarah, I admitted. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this. I don't know how to just move on. I'm not asking you to move on, she said, tears welling in her eyes. I'm asking you to let me help you. Let's figure this out together. We can't keep living like this. It's tearing us apart. I don't know if we can fix this, I said quietly, staring at the floor. Every time I look at you, all I see is that picture. I can't get it out of my head. She wiped at her tears, her voice breaking as she said, I hate that I hurt you. I hate that I kept this from you. But you're my husband, and I love you. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, but I need you to meet me halfway. Halfway? I said bitterly. Sarah, I've been the one compromising since day one. I'm the one who's expected to forgive, to forget, to hold this family together while everyone else just gets a free pass. That's not fair, she said, her voice rising slightly. I've apologized. I've admitted I was wrong. I've begged you to let me make this right. What more do you want me to do? I didn't have an answer. I wanted to forgive her, to move past this, but the anger and hurt were still too raw. I don't know, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She sat there in silence for a moment, then said, I think we need therapy. The suggestion caught me off guard. Therapy? Yes, she said, her tone firm despite the tears streaming down her face. Couples therapy? We can't fix this on our own, and I don't want to lose you. Part of me wanted to agree, to hold on to the shred of hope that we could salvage our relationship. But another part of me wondered if it was already too late. Could therapy really help? Or were we just delaying the inevitable? I don't know if I'm ready for that, I admitted. Please, she said, her voice cracking. Don't give up on us. At least try. If you can't do it for me, do it for yourself. For us. Her desperation was palpable, and it made my chest ache. I hated seeing her like this, knowing I was the reason for her pain. But what choice did I have? My trust had been shattered, and rebuilding it felt like an impossible task. I'll think about it, I said finally. She nodded, wiping her eyes and trying to steady her breathing. That's all I'm asking, she said. We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of our unspoken fears hanging heavy in the air. I wanted to believe that therapy could be the solution, that we could somehow find our way back to the love and trust we'd once shared. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I had the strength to try. As the days passed, the distance between us only seemed to grow. Every interaction felt like a fragile truce, held together by a thread of hope that was fraying more with each passing moment. The cracks in our marriage were no longer hidden. They were glaring, undeniable. And for the first time, I began to wonder if love alone was enough to hold us together. I hadn't spoken much to my sister since everything started unraveling. We'd never been the kind of siblings who confided in each other daily, but there was always a quiet understanding between us. So when she texted me out of the blue asking if I wanted to grab coffee, I was hesitant. I wasn't sure if she wanted to weigh in on the family drama or just check in, but I agreed to meet her. We met at a quiet cafe near her apartment. She was already there when I arrived, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly as she stared out the window. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, but there was a nervousness in her expression that immediately put me on edge. Hey, she said, standing up to give me a hug. Hey, I replied, sitting across from her. What's up? She shrugged, taking a sip of her coffee. I just wanted to see how you're doing. Mom's been worried about you. I scoffed, leaning back in my chair. Of course she has. I'm the problem, right? That's not what I meant, she said quickly. I know things have been complicated lately. I thought maybe you could use someone to talk to. I raised an eyebrow. And you think that someone is you? Why not? She said with a small smile. I'm your sister. Who else is going to give you the blunt truth? I let out a dry laugh. Blunt truth, huh? Is that what this is about? Are you here to tell me I'm overreacting too? Her smile faded, and she looked down at her coffee. No, she said softly. I'm not here to tell you how to feel. But I do think you need to hear a different perspective. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Okay, I said. Let's hear it. She took a deep breath, as if bracing herself. I've known about the whole thing for a while, she admitted. Her words felt like a punch to the gut. What? Dad told me a couple of years ago, she continued, her voice cautious. He said it wasn't a big deal and that it didn't mean anything, but he wanted me to know in case it ever came up. And you didn't think to tell me? I asked, my voice rising. It wasn't my place, she said, meeting my gaze. He made it clear that he and Sarah didn't want you to know, and I didn't want to cause unnecessary drama. I thought if they were both okay with it, then it wasn't my business. I shook my head, anger bubbling to the surface. So you weren't on it too. Great. Is there anyone in this family who didn't know? Don't do that, she said, her voice firm. Don't let me in with them. I didn't lie to you. I just stayed out of it because I thought it was ancient history. Clearly, I was wrong. I didn't respond, the weight of her words settling over me like a heavy blanket. I'm not saying what they did was right, she continued. They should have told you. You had a right to know, and they handled it badly. But I think you're letting this consume you, and it's hurting you more than it's hurting them. Her words stung because I knew there was some truth to them. I was angry, hurt, and betrayed, but I couldn't deny that my anger was starting to feel like a weight I couldn't shake. Do you really want to lose your wife over this? She asked, her voice softer now. Over something that happened before you were even in the picture? It's not just about what happened, I said, my voice tight. It's about the lies, the secrecy. How can I trust her, or Dad, after this? You build trust, she said simply. It's not easy, and it won't happen overnight. But if you love Sarah, and I know you do, you owe it to yourself to try. I looked away, my jaw clenched. It's not that simple. I know it's not, she said gently. But sometimes we make things harder than they need to be. You're angry, and you have every right to be. But at some point, you have to ask yourself if holding on to that anger is worth it. Is it worth losing the life you've built with Sarah? The future you've been planning? Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand, but deep down, I knew she was right. I was so focused on my pain and betrayal that I hadn't stopped to think about what I was risking by pushing Sarah away. I'm not saying you have to forgive them right now, she added, or even that you should, but don't let your pride ruin something that could still be fixed. We sat in silence for a while, the noise of the cafe buzzing around us. I thought about everything she'd said, about the future I'd been so sure of before all of this came crashing down. Why are you telling me this? I asked finally. Why now? Because I don't want to see you throw your life away over something you might regret later, she said. I know you and I know how much you love Sarah. Don't let this be the thing that destroys you. I nodded slowly, her words sinking in. Thanks, I said quietly. She smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. You're my brother. I'll always have your back, even when you're being stubborn. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, things weren't as broken as they seemed. But whether that spark would grow into something more, that was a question I still didn't have the answer to. Agreeing to therapy with Sarah felt like stepping into uncharted territory. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd need, much less something I wanted. But after the conversation with my sister, I couldn't ignore the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to salvage what was left of my marriage. The first session was awkward. We sat in a softly lit office with cushy chairs and an air of forced calm that did little to soothe my nerves. Our therapist, Dr. Lang, was a middle-aged woman with a kind face and an unassuming demeanor. She started by asking us to share why we were there. Sarah went first. Her voice shook as she explained the situation, laying bare the truth about her past with my dad and how she had kept it from me. She didn't shy away from admitting her mistakes, which surprised me. I half expected her to sugarcoat things, but she didn't. I was terrified of losing him, she said, her eyes fixed on her hands in her lap. I thought if I told him the truth, he'd look at me differently, that it would ruin everything we'd built together. I didn't want to hurt him, so I kept it to myself. But I see now that keeping the secret hurt him even more. Hearing her say those words out loud, in front of someone else, was strangely validating. It was the first time I felt like she truly understood the depth of the damage her choices had caused. When it was my turn to speak, I found myself struggling to articulate the whirlwind of emotions I'd been dealing with: anger, betrayal, humiliation, and a deep sadness that seemed to overshadow everything else. I feel like my trust was shattered, I said finally. Not just by Sarah, but by my dad too. They both made decisions about my life without giving me a say. And now, I'm left trying to pick up the pieces while they act like it should all be fine. Dr. Lang nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's understandable that you feel this way, she said. Betrayal of trust, especially from the people closest to us, can feel deeply destabilizing. But the fact that you're both here, willing to confront this, says a lot about your commitment to working through it. The session continued, and Dr. Lang guided us through exercises that felt uncomfortable at first, but gradually started to help. She asked us to describe how we'd felt in the moments when the truth came out. No interruptions, no defensiveness, just raw honesty. I felt like my entire world had been turned upside down, I admitted. I kept asking myself, how could they do this to me? How could they think it was okay to keep something like this a secret?" Sarah's voice trembled as she responded, and I felt like the worst person in the world. "I knew I'd made a mistake by not telling you, but by the time I realized it, it felt too late. I didn't know how to fix it." Dr. Lang listened patiently, offering insights and reframing our feelings in ways that made them feel less overwhelming. She explained that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of a relationship, but that rebuilding trust requires both time and effort from both sides. Over the next few sessions, we began to unpack the deeper issues that had been buried beneath the surface. It wasn't just about the secret anymore. It was about how we communicated, how we handled conflict, and how we could move forward without resentment poisoning our relationship. One breakthrough moment came when Sarah opened up about her fears. "I've always been scared of being judged," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I grew up in a family where mistakes weren't forgiven easily. I thought if I kept this part of my past hidden, I could avoid that judgment. But I see now that I was wrong. I was so focused on protecting myself that I didn't think about how it would affect you." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. For the first time, I saw her not as someone who had betrayed me, but as someone who was deeply flawed and deeply human. It didn't erase the pain, but it softened the edges just enough for me to consider the possibility of forgiveness. Dr. Lang also encouraged me to confront my feelings about my dad. While he wasn't in the sessions, his role in all of this loomed large. I hadn't spoken to him since our argument, and the thought of facing him again still made my stomach churn. "It's okay to take your time," Dr. Lang said. "Healing isn't a linear process, and it's not something you can force. But holding on to anger indefinitely can be just as damaging as the betrayal itself. The goal isn't to forget what happened. It's to find a way to move forward, whether that involves forgiveness or simply acceptance." Her words stayed with me long after the session ended. Forgiveness still felt like a distant possibility, but I was beginning to see that clinging to my anger wasn't serving me either. As the sessions continued, Sarah and I slowly started to rebuild the connection we'd lost. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension and doubt, but we were talking, really talking for the first time in weeks. One night after therapy, Sarah turned to me and said, "I know I can't erase what happened, but I want you to know how much I regret hurting you. You're the most important person in my life, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prove that to you." Her words were sincere, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. I wasn't ready to forgive her or my dad just yet, but for the first time, I started to believe that forgiveness didn't have to mean forgetting. Maybe it was possible to hold on to the lessons without letting the pain define our future. And maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward after all. The choice loomed over me like a dark cloud. Hold on to my anger and let it dictate the rest of my life, or find a way to forgive and move forward. It wasn't a decision I could make lightly. Every time I thought I was ready to let go, a flood of emotions would rise again. Anger, hurt, betrayal. But amidst the chaos, there was also a quiet realization. I didn't want my life to be defined by this pain. Sarah and I had spent weeks in therapy, and while the scars of her secrets still lingered, I could feel a shift in our relationship. We were slowly rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt, but I could see how hard she was trying. She didn't just say she was sorry. She showed it in every little thing she did. One evening, we sat together on the couch, an old movie playing in the background. She turned to me, her expression serious but gentle. "I know things will never be the same," she said, her voice steady. "But I want you to know how grateful I am that you've given us a chance to fix this. I know I don't deserve it, but I'll never stop trying to make it up to you." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about choosing to move forward despite the pain. Sarah wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But we loved each other, and that love was worth fighting for. "I'm not there yet," I admitted, meeting her gaze. "But I'm trying. I don't want to lose what we've built together. I just need time." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Take all the time you need," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." As for my dad, that was a more complicated story. We'd seen each other a few times since the blow-up, mostly at family gatherings where civility was more of an obligation than a choice. Our conversations were brief and polite, but the underlying tension was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, he called me out of the blue. "Can we meet for lunch?" he asked. I hesitated but agreed. We met at a diner we used to go to when I was a kid. As we sat across from each other, the weight of everything unsaid hung heavy in the air. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. And you're right. I should have told you. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was just protecting myself. I'm sorry. Hearing those words was both a relief and a frustration. Part of me wanted to accept his apology and move on, but another part of me couldn't ignore the damage his silence had caused. I appreciate that, I said finally. But it's going to take time. Things can't just go back to the way they were. I understand, he said, nodding. I just hope that one day we can get there. It wasn't the resolution I wanted, but it was a start. Forgiveness wasn't something I could give freely, not yet. But it felt good to hear him acknowledge the hurt he'd caused. My mom, on the other hand, hadn't changed her stance. She still believed I was overreacting, that the past should stay in the past. Her texts and calls continued, each one laced with a thinly veiled plea to make peace for the sake of the family. You can't hold on to this forever, she said during one of our conversations. At some point, you need to let it go. I'm working on it, I replied, trying to keep my frustration in check. Good, she said, because family is all we have at the end of the day. Her words rang hollow. Family wasn't just about shared blood or forced gatherings. It was about trust, respect, and love. And right now, those things felt fragile at best. In the months that followed, I found myself slowly letting go, not of the memories, but of the anger that had consumed me for so long. I realized that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or condoning what had happened. It simply meant choosing not to let it define my future. Sarah and I began to find our rhythm again. It wasn't always easy, but we were learning how to communicate in ways we hadn't before. Therapy had taught us to be honest, even when it was uncomfortable, and that honesty became the foundation for the next chapter of our lives. My relationship with my dad remained a work in progress. We were civil, even cordial at times, but the closeness we once shared felt out of reach. Maybe it always would be, but I'd come to accept that some relationships change, and not all of them can be fully repaired. This experience taught me more than I ever wanted to know about the complexities of love, trust, and family. It showed me that people are messy and flawed, and that sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront those flaws head-on. In the end, I chose forgiveness. Not because I was okay with what had happened, but because I didn't want to let it consume me. I chose to fight for the life Sarah and I had built together, to believe in the possibility of healing, even when it felt impossibly far away. Family is messy. It's full of mistakes, misunderstandings, and moments of profound hurt. But it's also full of love, resilience, and second chances. Sometimes, you have to decide what's worth fighting for, and what's worth letting go. For me, forgiveness wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And while I wasn't sure where it would ultimately lead, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to give up on the people I loved. Not yet.